This is Season 2, Episode 7 of Mastering the RPG, a tabletop RPG podcast all about upping your game. Doesn't matter if you're a game master or player, you'll find advice, ideas, and some pretty strong opinions. Our episode tonight is Preparing and Running Published RPG Campaigns, or I Prep Because I Care. Welcome to Mastering the RPG. Like I said, it's an RPG podcast all about upping your game with ideas, advice, sometimes cool stuff found, sometimes email, lots of good stuff. I'm Carl, again with my co-hosts Eric and James, and you can find information about us at masteringtherepg.com, or you can send us an email, some feedback, questions, anything like that to gamemaster@masteringtherepg.com. So, I'd like to say good to see you guys, good to hear you. James, what you been up to?
G'day guys, I've been taking a bit of a break. I've had 5 days away from my school games, which have been amazing. Just running 2 games of Dungeons & Dragons this week. And bizarrely enough, I've been doing a lot of prepping published adventures. I'm running 3 different published adventures next term, so prepping 10 sessions for the next term for my smaller kids' game. So this chat is very timely. I'm doing exactly this.
Awesome. Eric, how about you? What you been up to?
I've been mostly doing non-game things, a lot of yard work and gardening, planting, a lot of hard back-breaking work. But on the game side, I've been continuing to work on my setting that I'm almost done, my Savage World setting that I'm excited to then play a campaign to run. So that should be exciting. And there's a lot of new systems coming out and things being kickstarted. So I'm kind of reading different systems and getting into that more. So yeah.
Very cool. Personally, I just had the one campaign I'm working on. The players have discovered something kind of interesting in the last game. Sort of a little bit of more insight into the world or the universe, so to speak. Otherwise, my God, just putting video content, Final Cut, all that stuff. So just trying to get all the stuff that Eric and I put together and we've done for the show, and just a lot of work there. So, but a little bit of gaming stuff. So that's pretty much fun. I'm very excited that you've been prepping some campaigns because it's been a little bit of time since I prepped my last campaign that used a published framework. And so it'd be great to talk a little bit about that.
I'm a glutton for punishment. This year, I don't know why I've done this. In the past, I've tended to prep one campaign and run it multiple times for my different groups because I do this professionally. So, but this year I'm an idiot and am running 5 different games, 3 of which are published adventures, but separate published adventures. So I'm overdoing it with my prep. I prep way too much, which is slowly killing me inside. But apart from that, it's good fun. It is good fun, and I get to prepare some very good published high-end adventures, which I'm very happy about. I've managed to pick some very good ones this year.
So we'll get right into it. Eric is going to take the lead tonight. He's going to lead us through exploring this interesting topic that is preparing adventures. So on to the main topic.
Mastering the RPG with Carl, Eric, and James. Yeah.
All right, we're here with the main topic. Eric, take it away.
Yeah, so tonight we're talking about published campaigns. Just a little backstory in my own experience with this. I've never ran a published campaign, and I barely played in. I played in one real life one, and then I played in, I think, James, you ran one. You went pretty wild with that one anyway. So I have the least amount of experience, so I will be the interviewer, and these are my interviewees because I just don't know much about this. But yeah, I think the first thing to start is let's define what we mean. And these are what we're talking about. We're going to talk about the campaign versions of these, where this is if you think of the D&D books or Pathfinder, that's kind of the main ones that come to mind, right? Of a level range. Usually it's levels 1 to 5, sometimes they're levels 1 to 20 or whatever your game has. And it's a full campaign, an enclosed story that you buy, and that they give you the story and the tools to run these games. So yeah, I will be using the term AP, which stands for Adventure Pass. That's what Pathfinder uses, and I just like it, and it's just it's just easy to use it that way. So yeah, so these come in all different sorts of themes, but they're all kind of unified in how they're structured. So let's get right into it. So the first kind of topic we'll talk about today is selecting them. Like, how do you select them? What's the process? So yeah, so the first thing first is, what do you look for in like an adventure path? Like what do you look for that's like that okay, it's a good, like it's or what are the things that you like that attract you to a certain type of adventure path? So James, let's start with you. What do you look for?
So when I pick my adventure paths, particularly from published campaigns, there's a couple of things that I'm looking for first. The first one is an engaging setting, something that I know that I'll be interested in, because I guess when you're picking a published campaign, you're committing yourself to a chunky part of your time. I try and crunch a published module, or a published campaign, I should say, into about 80 hours of gameplay. And so what you're trying to find is a setting that you're going to be interested in, that you're going to be able to kind of describe and immerse yourself in. And then, trickily, the next part's a little bit harder to find and a little bit harder to make sure you've got, I guess, before you buy. But what I'm looking for is an engaging plot that involves engaging non-player characters, that is not necessarily totally linear in its makeup, but also allows you to kind of play around with it a little bit. So that's often very, very difficult to know before you pick it off the shelf. Let's face it, you go into your friendly neighborhood game shop and flick through a book, or you read a review. It's difficult to actually find that. But I guess after buying a few of them and flipping through a few of them, you're looking for that engaging flow-through plot that isn't necessarily linear, and some good chunky NPCs in there to help make it breathe it to life. They're the three things that I'm looking for.
Okay. Carl, what about you? What are the things that you look for in adventure?
I think what James brought up is really kind of the crux of it. But one of the things that I also look at is, does this adventure path or this campaign meet the way my play style? Does it work with the way I do things? Because I like to look at them more as frameworks to fit my own needs, my own campaign, as opposed to I just want a full start to finish storyline. In Savage Worlds, we call them plot point campaigns, and they're a little bit different than a full fleshed out published story that has text boxes to read and everything kind of statted out to the nth degree. And I kind of look for those kinds of stories that I can fit into kind of what I'm trying to do, as opposed to something that leads me by the nose. But I think, James, you hit right on that, right? You want an engaging story. You want something that's not too linear, that's not too railroady. But, really in the end, the players are going to be unique. What I'm trying to get across is going to be unique. And I want something that helps me do that and isn't just going to be the same as everyone else who runs this adventure. It'll just feel the same every time.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting? Because I run this professionally, there's an expectation from my customers that they do get the published adventure that everyone else does, that they can say, I've done Curse of Strahd, or I've done Masks of Nyarlathotep, I've done the published one. So it's an interesting kind of different way. When I'm running games for friends and family, I totally agree. I'm kind of loosely hanging the adventure path based on my style and based on what my players are interested into. But I've found myself over the past 4 or 5 years having to really deliver the game that in its published way. So it makes for a very different preparation experience, really.
And I think
I guess it comes down to needs a lot, because in your cases, it really seems like you guys like the flexibility because it's more fun for you to then to mess around with and kind of add your own things in. Where some other people who might be, strapped for time or something, just want the straight experience, right? Like they just want to be able just to run it and don't have to do as much prep. But yeah, for you guys, it's obviously just more engaging to be able to have something that gives you the tools without telling you what to do completely. Right?
Yeah, and my memory's not good enough to be able to remember every detail. So they're going to change.
Of course.
I might as well plan for that.
Well, we got a lot to talk about, so let's just quickly talk about here. What are some of the tips and tricks of actually selecting the ones that you want? Like, if you're online or you're in the game store and here's all these books in front of you, how do you kind of like, relatively quickly be like, oh, this is an AP for me. This is the AP that I'm looking for. Like, do you have any kind of tips and tricks, or you just kind of read the whole thing or look at reviews? Carl, anything?
Well, you're not, I think James mentioned, you're not going to pick that up by paging through it in the store. But what you can understand is know your own style. You're going to be running this, I guess, many tens of hours. And each one of these different books, they have a different feel to them. Some are over the top. Some are more mystery. Some are more, there's even now adventure paths. They're all about heist, right? I don't use a lot of D&D published adventures I'm not a D&D guy, but there's a lot of them out there. So you need to kind of know what you're interested in. Curse of Strahd's not going to be a great one if you're not a horror kind of person and you want to play it silly, right? So know your own style when you're picking things out. I think is one thing I would think about.
Okay. James, do you have any tips?
Yeah, there's a couple of things I do when I pick up when I receive an adventure, because I tend to buy them all. So when they come out of the mail and I have a look and go, all right, let's see what this thing looks like. The first thing is most published campaigns will provide a plot path, an adventure path, in full somewhere in the first kind of chapter of the campaign. It generally says what each chapter of the campaign will cover, some majority of the plot points, and how you go from point A to point B to point C to point D as you go through the adventure. So I tend to read that absolutely first thing I flick through, even before anything else. The other trick that I do is I read the last chapter first, because ultimately getting an idea about how the final boss battle or how the whole thing culminates at the end does a couple of things for me. It does that excite me, oh wow, this is cool. Look at the final epic battle is against a god, against a dragon, against a kraken. This kind of sense of how does this fit in. But it also allows me to prep a lot easier, because if I know what the end point looks like, then I can understand the plot points to get me to that end point, the clues that I need to be putting out there before I get to the end point. So I tend to read backwards. I read the last chapter first and then see how it all moves on to there. The other thing I do, of course, is have a good flick through, and for me it's a lot about the artwork. The artwork gives me a sense of setting. It gives me a sense of the visual nature of the campaign, and if I find that exciting, then that helps me in terms of visualizing how I'm going to describe the campaign well to my players.
Okay, so I could see somebody there then, if they're having trouble selecting, like you said, look at the outline. Is it well organized? And then picking out the end battle, picking out maybe the Act 2, end of that, and see if it does seem like it comes together. I guess you could get a pretty good idea of, okay, this is written well, based on kind of cherry picking the climax, right? That's interesting.
And funnily enough, I find chapters 3 and 4 are where all your problems occur. So if you want to know if there's going to be a problematic game, that midpoint of 3 and 4, have a good look through to that, because that's often your hex crawl or your exploration or your let's find out about the world. A lot of writers will focus in on the start to try and engage a really exciting start. They'll focus on the end, a really exciting ending. It's that midpoint that's where you get into all sorts of trouble. So I'll have a flick through that as well.
Okay, cool. And I guess I didn't really talk about this before, but what are the main, just for you guys real quick, what are the main kind of advantages versus for doing this versus making your own? Obviously there's some time there, but do you have any other kind of advantages that you think on just on the top of your head, Carl, compared to just running it on yourself without any type of pre-published?
Well, the big thing is that you're not the end. I'm not as creative as I think I am. And there's a lot of interesting stories that people have come up with. There's a reason why some of these adventure paths are very, very popular, because they're creative and interesting, and they've got those engaging NPCs. And so I think it's really nice. What it does is, by playing some of those, it gives you, even if you're primarily a homebrew person, you get to see how other people think and how other people create games and adventures. And I think, James, you're feeling around the edges when you say, hey, the ending they focus on, the beginning they focus on, they don't focus so much. Well, then if you find somebody who does a good job focusing in the middle part, you're going to learn something from them if you're trying to run that adventure path to use the Pathfinder word. I'll keep using Adventure Path too. But
yeah, that's
what so it's I think that's one of the advantages. I don't think it's faster to run a pre-published versus a homebrew, honestly. So I don't think that's an actual advantage, but that's a whole nother conversation probably.
And that's
in and
for
of
you,
itself.
when you're doing these one-on-one. I imagine, James, it might be a little bit different for you because you do all these games at once, and having that framework makes it easier to run many games, right? Is that the main advantage?
Oh, yeah, yeah. And look, I'm an exception rather than the rule. For me, it's if I was to run 10 homebrew games a week, but just the ability to keep track of all the bullshit that I made up would be the hardest part. I just would never be able to do it. Whereas if I can run published games, then at least I know, they're up to page 38. That's pretty simple about what they've experienced and what they're about to experience. I think there's a really big advantage with running published adventures for very beginner dungeon masters and storytellers and games masters. Using a published campaign when you're first starting out helps you get a really good understanding of structure and how story unveils.
Yeah.
And it provides things like encounter balance for you that's been play tested. Some of the real tricks that step up beginning games masters are kind of ironed out a little bit more as well. So, the other thing is in terms of there are a lot of these published campaigns come with heaps of resources. So, pre-published maps, pre-published artwork. There are even Sirenscape soundtracks that are now set up for your pre-published campaign. So you just have to click a button for the sound. So there are, and I guess a lot of designers and third-party designers cash in on pre-published work too. So to find those resources and those handouts and those tokens and bits and pieces, it's far easier to do so with a pre-published adventure.
Of course, yeah. And that you guys make the good point of, writers often, they read a lot to learn how to write better. And people who are running these games, right, we're not going to school to learn how to DM. Like, you have to learn just by experiencing it or by running it. So it is a good way to kind of teach yourself in a lot of ways. But let's move on. Let's move on to the next phase, which is all about preparing. How do we prepare this before we actually run it? So, James, what does your initial kind of setup look like when you're kind of getting with a new book in front of you? Like, what's the kind of first things you do to set up?
So it's a little tricky. Everyone, a lot of people that I recommend you read the campaign, the adventure path from start to finish, so that you get an understanding out of everything that's going on. I tend to not do that. I find that essentially reading every page of the campaign at the beginning, it may be a year before you actually get up to chapter 6 or chapter 7. And so I tend to skim read, and I tend to focus in on a third of the campaign at a time. So I look at the first third. I break out my little sticky notes, and the things I'm looking for are main plot thread, and subplot threads when I'm looking through this. So, what is the main thrust of the campaign? What's the main plot? Where do we need to go from A to B to C to D to further the main plot? But I'm also looking for themes. I'm looking for subplot themes that intertwine. And this is where you can add your own stamp on games. You can really focus in on a subplot. You can really focus in on these sub-themes. And importantly, when I first start to pick this apart, that's what I'm looking for to involve my characters and to involve my character backstories. Because I guess one of the tricks with running a published adventure is, as opposed to a homebrew adventure, is how do I make this appealing and how do I make this centered still on players? Because I still want to run a player character-centric game, even though it's a published module. So I'm looking for opportunities through theme and through subplots on how I can involve my player characters even better. That's, I guess, my first reading of the adventure.
Okay. Carl, what do you do when you get a new kind of book in front of you? What's your initial prep?
I think James is right on point. The first thing I do is I read enough of the campaign to start understanding it, and then maybe skim the rest to know where some of the key elements are. I think this comes back to the core themes, the thread that's going through, so that I know how each one of those items is going to interact with the players. And then I look at, so as part of that, I think that we forget about sometimes is look at those key NPCs and understand their motivations and kind of what they're trying to do, as opposed to they're just text on a page. It's really get inside their head, because then that's going to make it so much easier when you start preparing for the actual adventure within the campaign, where you understand how the enemy's going to react, what they're going to do based on the first, characters do something along the lines in the beginning adventure. You know that the next adventure comes along, players are going to do something a little bit different than the campaign designer thought. So now you understand the motivations of those NPCs, and you can bob and weave and get them back to sort of following kind of what the core, as James said, there's the core storyline that you're trying to follow, and the players are going to go off of it, right? They're going to veer back and forth as they go along. So I really try to understand what the NPCs are trying to do, what the key elements are throughout the whole story. And then I ignore the last half of the book while I'm really prepping, because there's just too much there to keep in mind. You understand what's supposed to happen. Now you can focus on the details. Things like the enemy tactics and that sort of thing. And one of the other things I think I do initially, and James probably does the same thing, I look at stuff that I go, there's no way in hell I'm going to run this. There's just no chance that this is going to work out. It's just not something that I even know how to do. There's some weird something about this particular adventure, and so it's like, it's not gold. It's garbage. It's hot. I'll throw it out. Now, what am I going to put in there instead to keep people moving along? So that's, in the initial reading, you're going to find things that's just like, I just don't want to play this adventure. This is dumb, or it's just not going to meet my needs. And so those are a couple of the things that I do just to start off with as I'm prepping. So really get into NPCs' minds, the core themes, and then start removing the chaff right away so that I don't spend time dealing with it. Now that may be a problem, right? If again, people are looking for that, the actual adventure path as it was written, then there's a problem, because I'm going to pull written stuff out and throw it away because it's just not something that I can feel good about running, or whatever the reason is.
But the trick is you can pull things out if they're not related to your main plotline. Like if they're not following the main thoroughfare, if they're not following the main river of the story, then it doesn't really matter if you kind of pull an encounter or a character or a scene or a whole aspect of the story, as long as your main thread is running true. And yeah, I do that all the time. An NPC that just go, that's ridiculous. A side track or a side quest that you just go, I just don't want to be running this. You can pull it out pretty quickly and pretty easily. I guess, I'm in a little bit of a stranger situation that other storytellers won't be in, but one of the tricks that I do as well, because I know that I'm running a campaign a year and I have 40 sessions to run, I actually start to plot out early what my first 10 sessions will look like, what my first 20 hours or 30 hours might look like, which allows me to go through the compartmentalizing of where are my cliffhangers going? How do I set this up in the first 2 or 3 sessions? So, but then again, I'm doing this at a much larger scale. But being able to break down that first third of the book into my first 10 sessions is also a handy little trick that I've learnt over the years of doing this.
Yeah, I think that's some very good advice. I think a big thing always is don't be afraid to cut out stuff that doesn't work for you. Yeah. Don't be beholden to the book, because the book's there just as a guide, as a framework. And I think, Carl, what you talked about NPCs, using them as kind of the guideposts, because you'll have the most flexibility then to add your own stuff in and to bring things back into the story. Same with you, James, that having an outline. And I think you could even write down those NPCs, right? You could write them down and then even put their motivations, just so you have like your notes on that. I think that's a good thing to go with.
Well, I did a little research on this one, and people do talk a lot about the mechanics of prepping, and that's some of the things they talk about. Take the NPCs; each one gets their
pop them out.
Each one gets their little index card, and then you tape that index card with the places where they appear. They're in these sessions, and here's their motivation. So there's a lot of mechanical help that you can take away from some of those from some of those resources online. People get really into the details of how you put all this stuff together.
Absolutely.
Okay, so you guys have done your setup, but half of the game is with players. So before you even start, what is it you do to what does it do specifically that you help prepare players for what kind of you're playing? Because when you're doing your own game, you can be much more flexible with often where you're going or where they're living from, right? So usually when you're playing an adventure path, it's in a specific setting, it's in a specific place in the setting that has lore around it. So what do you do to help prepare your players? Carl, like when you get one, what do you do?
Well, I think most of the time players don't know everything that goes into these games, nor should they, right? Because that's part of the fun. But you need to be upfront with what the adventure path is essentially about. Not everything, but is this going to be, the thing like Curse of Strahd? It's people know that name and they know what it means to have that adventure. But somebody coming in cold, this is going to be mysterious, kind of horror. Do you guys really are you into that? It's going to be about exploring these ruins, or this is going to be. I think you need to be upfront, and it's that session 0 kind of conversation, just like you would if you're doing your own homebrew, right? You've got the two. You got the elevator pitch. You need to take and make that elevator pitch for the adventure and set those expectations. I mean, you have a central theme. There's a central hook that is going to thread that's going to run through the whole thing, and so you need to be upfront about that. I think that's the very first thing to concern yourself with.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess, because we talk about session 0 all the time, I guess also, is there anything even more specific that applies from adventure paths that, different from even your own stuff, that is kind of like a unique thing to help prepare players? James, what do you do as far as that?
There's a couple of things I do, and they don't differ too much from homebrew, but I think they're still important to do. Like the little one-page plot summary sheet that I give out to my players before any campaign, you really need to do for a published adventure, just so that your players are aware, what Carl was saying, what they're getting themselves into, and the theme of the game, and so that they're not creating characters that are completely at odds with the setting. Because I guess when you're running a homebrew game, everyone gets their characters together, everyone puts their backgrounds together, everyone puts their backstories together, and you kind of mesh it all together, and you can kind of create your own overarching story plot that helps pin on those backstories. With a published adventure, it's far more difficult. You have to align the backstories with the NPCs and with the plot lines that are within the story.
Yeah.
And so highlighting what the main plot is in a very overview manner, so that people are aware of what adventure they're getting themselves into, providing a little bit more information about setting so that the players will align themselves with the kinds of characters. And so for my kids' games, for example, I restrict the character backgrounds and lineages that they can have so that we make sure that everything's kind of fitting within the storyline and within the setting. And importantly, in that first session, getting an understanding where those subplots are within the published adventure allows for the beginning of those conversations where you can to and fro with the characters, with the player backgrounds, and how it can fit within the storyline. So knowing that the big bad has killed your parents, well, with a published adventure, you need to know the name of that big bad and know who that likely is to be, so that you can provide that information to the players earlier rather than later. So that first session 1, that toing and froing with background information becomes very critical with a published adventure, because you've got to fit it in with the published.
Seems like even more so, and that's kind of the challenges that I was thinking of, because the few times that I have played in a AP, it was definitely, it feels like it's a little bit more constrained as far as how crazy you can go with your own character and their backstory. So I think, James, what you're saying is you're basically you give more information than you would as when you do a homebrew, just because it's in such a specific place that's kind of integral to the rest. And even while there is some flexibility, you don't have as much flexibility, right? Is that kind of the overall?
Yeah, very, very. If I think of, I'm running Call of the Netherdeep, for example, published adventure by the guys from Critical Role. Right at the beginning of my one page, and every discussion that I've had with the groups that are playing that adventure, I've had to say, you guys are heroes that look after and protect people.
Yeah.
You know, and had to be really overt and really specific, because if you don't approach that adventure with that mindset of you're being effectively the good guys, the whole adventure falls apart very, 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 very quickly. And so, whereas normally in a homebrew game, you'd come up with all sorts of nefarious, chaotic, neutral kind of guys that would be completely crazy and zany, and that's okay because you're running a homebrew game. In this kind of sense, you've got to be very, very specific about the kinds of characters that they can play in order to make the whole thing work. Which is why a lot of people don't do them, because they go, this is too restricting, this is too difficult to run. I prefer a far more open world. So it is one of the downsides to running a published campaign. But if you get it right, it means that running it becomes a lot easier.
For sure. So just before we move on, is there any other tips or tricks you guys have left that you can think of as far as just preparing it, Carl? Do you have any other ones? Or yeah.
I just really want to very, very strongly point out that you do need to outline some of the key points, those key plot points, and know why things are happening. And then, like I said, with the NPCs, who's making them happen, because you have to be able to react to what the players are doing. And if you are just reading box text and just reading the paragraphs as people are doing things, then you're just not going to be able to make a decision. And it'll get into the running, right? Decisions you make can take your game off the rails when we start talking about running one. So I think it's super important to have the key parts outlined and captured, and know what's going to happen, so that if you need to do something that contradicts that narrative element, you do it in a way that's very thoughtful and purposeful.
Yeah, James, any more tips and tricks before we move on?
Tips and tricks for, I think Carl's run it. You know, the other side of understanding the NPCs too is the NPCs form the basis of a lot of your encounters, particularly combat encounters. So getting a good sense of what each of the bosses and mini-bosses are capable of doing through the published campaign will really guide the way that you will lead up to them, because if you understand that they've got scrying spells or charm spells or abilities that allow you to do different things, or high levels of intrigue or political connections or things like this, that'll allow you to role-play them better on the lead-up. And you really want to make these sub-boss and boss fights really memorable as the big cliffhanger points of the campaign. So understanding what they're capable of is really important. So yes, understanding motivations, but also understanding the capacity of NPCs are very, very, very important.
I'm sorry.
Go on. Sorry.
I was going to ask you another question, but if you have more to say, then.
Yeah. The other thing I try and find and try to get a sense of is the dramatic beats and the dramatic rests within the storyline when you're going through that initial pre-preparation, just getting a sense of where your climaxes are going to be, so that you can have your cliffhangers, you can end sessions on really high points, and you understand where your early breaks are going to be within a campaign. Campaigns are written with the idea that you go through trials and tribulations, but at some point there's a breather to allow the players to and the characters to breathe. Yeah. So getting a sense of that flow is also really, really important.
So do you guys see any value in maybe looking up what other people's experience, like on the internet, looking up what their experience with the campaign was, or what they went through, or watching not watching the whole thing, but watching highlights of an actual play? Do you think there's any value in seeing what other people have done or hearing about what other people have done, or does that kind of maybe take away, maybe will constrain you too much? Thoughts, I guess?
I very much do this. Okay. I think there is great value in it. I think that the internet is a rabbit warren that you can get caught up in, but I will say for most published adventures, I follow Reddit subthreads for most of them, and I join Facebook groups of storytellers that are running them, often so I can steal resources, but also you'll get some good ideas from them. In terms of actual plays, yes and no. Once I don't do it until I've had a good read. Once I've had a bit of a read through it and get a sense of how I'm going to run a big chunk of the story, I will then watch an actual play to see how another storyteller has interpreted that story. Not to override what I'm thinking, but they might come up with a cool angle that I hadn't considered. And you do get to see how players react to the story. So you do get to see how the players grab it, more than how the storyteller will run it, because if they're running it published, it's going to be similar to how you run it, but you do get to see how players, what appeals to them, what bored them. And yes, groups are different, but you do get to get a sense of, oh, that didn't go down too well, I might change the way that that's approached. And the resources are there, so in my mind, I use them.
Interesting.
Well, for me, I don't do a lot of actual plays, but now you make me very interested if I was going to run some of these longer format adventures. Maybe I should. But I do think it's really nice. There's a lot of people who go through, run these things, do really good reviews, talk about very much what these things are, almost to the spoiler level, about what these things are about. And we talked about this in the beginning as far as choosing an adventure path. There's a lot, if you've got an adventure path you're interested in, there's a lot of people who've played it, ran it, want to talk about it, that you can find on the internet and say, oh, this doesn't sound like my style, or this doesn't sound like, the picture on the box does not represent what's inside. So that's very useful for real, very useful to do. But you've got to be careful. There's a lot of spoilers. So if you're a player looking, then you may have some problems.
This is obviously not for players. We're talking about game masters here. So I think those are some good things. I think, looking up other people talk about that. They, they're basically beta testers, right? Like they could see, oh, here's a problem. This doesn't work in whatever, Act 2, Scene 2. And James, I think that's a really, really good point that you made. Before you watch somebody do it, you should definitely read it first, because that way you won't be so, if you watched it first, then even, subconsciously, you're going to be much more influenced by what they've done. Because that's the first thing that you've seen about it, right? And that's, for us, that has the biggest impact on our psyche. So I think that's a very good point, James, is you should always read it first, and then you can watch some actual plays. Okay, very cool.
The other thing is, and for some of the really epic campaigns, and I'm talking about the Curse of Strahd, Masks of Nyarlathotep, those kind of campaigns, the resources out there, the online resources are massive.
Yeah, people have made maps and for those things and character
even beyond that,
and,
whole episodes of background information where you can about preparing the game. There's a whole series for Curse of Strahd on how to do various accents for NPCs, how mouth shapes and accents, and there is a world of information out there that means you actually never have to think creatively ever, which might be a thing for you, might not be, but there is worlds of stuff out there which they're rabbit holes that you never escape from once you.
But obviously, that's for the pop. I mean, Curse. We keep talking about Curse of Strahd because that is almost infamously like one of the most famous adventure paths out there. Cool. Okay, let's move on to running them. So, just at the very top, what do you guys think are the main challenges of running an adventure path? We don't have to get too much detail on this part, but like what, again, almost compared to your own homebrew, when you actually get into the running of it, what are the kind of main challenges, James?
Some of them aren't good. I think it's just to be really brutal with it. You've got to really pick a good one. Otherwise, you get caught in a game that is just going to be hell. There are some infamously bad Dungeons and Dragons campaigns. There are some really quite poor Call of Cthulhu games. And so trying to find the good one is the best thing. Otherwise, you are constraining yourself to honestly a year of hell that makes it very, very, very difficult. In particular, some of the old school plots that tend to have a list of encounters that might not be overly connected to each other. In my mind, if I'm going to fork out for a campaign, it needs to be a cohesive plot. It needs to do what I need it to do, which is actually cut down on my preparation. I don't have the time to be filling in a lot of plot gaps and fixing someone else's work. And so one of the downsides is when you get one that sucks, it can be very, very difficult. Another downside is whether we like it or not, published adventures there's the risk of people having already played them. And bizarrely, there's a risk of players reading them while you do it. And I know it sounds a bit weird, but even adults, I still don't understand why you would do this. But I have had players that read the book on me, and I still don't know why on earth you would do this to yourself. But it is a risk that these things are out there, that there are spoilers. You can actually get the stat blocks of the monsters and the bosses, and you can watch the actual plays, and you can do all of those things. So one of the downsides of it, and one of the challenges is actually is players that already understand what you're doing.
Yeah, Carl, for you, are there anything like you've started to run the game, and then what are the kind of things that will pop up that are kind of the main challenges?
Well, there's two things that come to my mind all the time when I'm talking about these sort of things. The first one is the obvious keeping players on track. For better or worse, all published adventures have an expectation that you're going through this core plot line. And it's very easy for folks to wander off of that significantly because, we want to give players agency, right? That's part of the whole point. And so they can make decisions. And sometimes, and this goes maybe to what James was saying, they're just not good. The hooks aren't exciting enough to pull the players in to make them actually want to follow that primary story plot point. And that's something when you're prepping and you start looking at the game or the adventures and you look at something, you say, well, why would I do that if I was a player? So, in this one, you're supposed to meet the count and then decide that you're going to help him, do something. And it's like, why would they do that? There's no reason for them other than the adventure says it's something that they should do. So that's a big challenge. Second thing is players affecting the story, which is kind of the other side of that coin. Players have agency. I'm a huge proponent of them giving players the ability to do what they want, but sometimes they're going to make something that impacts the story, and you have to figure out a way to come back. Now, and one of the I'm a Savage Worlds guy, so one of the most famous plot point campaigns for ETU is Degrees of Horror. And in that particular plot point, there's a event where the players have to go to a rally, where everybody's getting together and they're rah-rah for their team and stuff like that, And if the players decide they don't want to go, the whole thing just stops in its tracks. Now, there's two things, right? Is that point to pull them in compelling enough to make them want to go? It should, they should be buying in, but that's one of the things. They don't go and it just doesn't happen. The other thing is they can let something happens at this rally and they're supposed to stop it. They could decide not to stop it, and then an important NPC dies who's supposed to come back later in the adventure. Now, I'm going from memory, so if you think I've got that wrong and you know how that plot point works exactly, send us an email with another question so that we can then use the email for something else. See what I did there? Since we don't have comments like YouTube, just send us an email and let's get it on air. But those are the two big ones, is really that action to players affecting the world in a way that's negative and then just keeping them on track. I don't know if I have the silver bullet on that. I know, James, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it too.
Yeah, let's actually talk about that, because I think the main thing that everybody thinks about with the published game is, like we bring up the term so much, is railroading, right?
Yep.
So what is the balance there? What is the balance? How do you keep players on track? Because at some point you have to, right? Because there's these main points that are published and everything is connected. So you can't just go totally off. So how do you keep them on track? And then without the illusion of that, like without making them feel like they're so constrained?
There's a couple of things. The first one is you have to read the thing. So you have to understand where the opportunities are to bring people back on track. I don't want to name names, but a certain group that played a Feywild game of mine, we had an encounter, and the storyline said the group has to help a force close a portal. And once the group has closed the portal, then they receive the accolades of the local lord, and then they're asked to continue on the adventure. Our group said, nope, we're not doing that. We're going to turn on the local lord, and we're going to go through the portal. And it completely screwed me for about 4 months of gameplay, Eric, and the Feywild group, so thank you for that. But because I've read through the plot and understand the overarching themes and where that goes, you have to do that pivot where effectively you get back on track. And there's a couple of big key things on this. The first one, and often we call these fronts, which is kind of what the bad guys are going to be doing regardless of what the players do. They continue. So if you think about a published adventure, being this is happening to the world, this is happening to the world in a big meta way, then that will continue regardless of what the players do. And so you have to then highlight what the world is going through. So a big example is a game I played last year called Storm King's Thunder. The world is being invaded by giants. The giants have awakened and they're destroying cities. One of my groups last year said, we don't actually care about this. We just want to be a traveling circus and we want to make money. And so for about 7 sessions, we played a group of traveling circus players where we were going around each town making money. But eventually the giants do what the giants do and start crushing the cities, start impacting on the world. Is that railroading? I don't think it is, because essentially the world continues and it's up to the players about how they go. It's not as though at the end of the street they have to do these things, but ultimately the effect happens no matter, on the players, and it provokes them to go in. The second tip that I have in keeping the players on track, and again, I drop this guy all the time, but Sly Flourish and the Lazy DM does this, which I actually really love. What he does is he pulls the plot points, and particularly secrets and clues within the plot, and he does not make them rely on a certain path of happening. So in Carl's idea, having that NPC that you have to save, or if the NPC dies, then the plot goes to hell. What is the information that NPC had?
Exactly.
What is the clues that NPC would deliver? And is there another way you can deliver those clues? Is there another way you can deliver that plot? Whether that's a document, it's another NPC, and again, it's a bit of illusion of choice, and this is a little bit railroady, but it does mean that you can get back on track very, very quickly, because ultimately it isn't that reliant on the plot to be intact for you to have a successful game.
I've even kind of related to that. I've even had another adventure that's not part of this adventure path, that I've just a little one that I've written that the players now interact with, that has the information that they've lost. It's another adventure, completely separate, but it still works in the overall theme, and it brings them back because it makes the plot hook or the information that much more in their face than maybe the published adventure did. So they missed it and they moved off and they missed the mark. That's also something that I think can help out as well.
Absolutely. In Masks of Nyarlathotep, one of the most convoluted plots I've ever had, I've had to create a traveling carnival that was a plot device. It allows me to kind of, you've interact with the carnival, they give you the information that you've missed, and you can get back onto the game. Absolutely. What a great suggestion, Carl. And this is where you can add things to your game as well, to focus in on the plot, to double down on the plot in a lot of ways. That absolutely helps. And in our Feywild game, for example, the war of the Fey was continuing, and just because they jumped ahead a few scenes, just meant I had to bring up the war and how that was going to that was going to unfold earlier than I possibly would have. And in fact, it threw you guys straight into the middle of it far sooner than what the book had even suggested. So I'm not sure if there's much advice in that, except understand your game in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what you were saying is just like you got to keep raising the stakes until the players almost have no choice. And when I was saying, railroading, I meant that as like I think people overuse that term, and most of our games are illusions of choice, right? Like within a certain scope, like if you prepared something and the players go left instead of right, then you can just take whatever you had right and use it later, right? So like I think that's used across different types of games, but. Yeah, are there anything else there that like really is like kind of that illusion of being able to give the players like, will you give them a feeling of they're not playing in an adventure path, but like, is there any other things that you do, or is that pretty much it?
I go back a bit again to player character backgrounds and their backstories, and how that is going to cement them in the world. Because if you've done that right at the beginning, then having your long-lost uncle appear in Chapter 3 because Chapter 3 doesn't really work, or it's the weak point, it then provides an extra stimulus for the group to continue. If you can, because again, even if it's a published campaign, you still want to tie it back to the motivations of your player characters. And if you do that right, then that helps you avoid this. It helps you avoid the characters just not engaging with your main plot. I think that's kind of a tip that I would give.
That's interesting, because I can also think, like, when in regards to backstories, because those are things that, while they're making them in the world of the AP, those are things that the writers didn't write. Those are things the players wrote. So you almost have, with backstory specifically, you have like almost, unless they've really tied it to like an NPC in the setting, right? You almost have the most freedom to, like, anything could happen with the things from your backstories, right? Your uncle, he could die. He could become rich. Like, because they made this uncle up, then you have complete freedom. So I think that is a really good point, James, is that utilize the player backgrounds, because that's where you have the most freedom, right, to kind of mess with them, and they'll have the most stakes in that anyways. So that's very interesting.
That's the important one. That's the bit that's going to have the stake. That's the bit that's going to push their button, hopefully in the direction where the main plot needs that button pushed.
Yeah, and you could almost do like a side adventure, right, with involving one of these backstories, because again, it's not going to impact the main narrative probably that much, but it impacts their own narrative, right, and that will give them that feeling.
Right.
Carl, is there anything that you do, like, specifically? I mean, it's a little bit different with Savage Worlds, but I know you've run other games too. But so is there anything that you kind of lose, to kind of like confound players into thinking that, oh, they're not playing it at Adventure Path?
Well, I think taking advantage of the backstory as an element is definitely one to use for sure. I think I kind of an improviser a little bit, so sometimes I let people have those choices, and even if those choices take me off rail, there's always some other thing that they could do to bring them back, and that's where I brought that adventure part up. There's always an adventure that can help bring them back in to kind of the fold. And I think you talk about the long lost uncle. That's the obviously thing, right? Take that backstory element that you have complete control over, and a long lost uncle comes and says, "Hey, did you know that the Fey War is still going on? Here, there's something you should go take care of for me."
And it's killed your auntie. Come and help.
Yeah,
it's like,
Yeah. So, is there anything else then about now talking more specifically about going off script? Like, you've either wrote it yourself or the players have led you there. Is there anything else that kind of helps you when you go off script? Carl?
Kind of. The thing that I try and do is bring it back as quick as you can.
Yeah.
So the tendency of going off script is that you end up going, I like this plot point, my players are enjoying it, let's explore this for a bit.
Yeah.
And before you know it, you've done 4 or 5 sessions unrelated to your plot, and it's actually, you're in peril of departing from your published adventure and turning it into a homebrew game. And that has happened a lot in my experience. And so trying to bring it back to the main plot is important. Otherwise, you tend to tread water a bit, and you tend to kind of waffle for a while.
Yeah.
So I'd be if you're going off script, try not to add fuel to that fire if you can. I mean, by all means, use it as a correction. Use it as an indulgence, but just remember it is a bit of an indulgence, if ultimately you want to get this story completed and done.
Yeah, and that's the key point. If you want to play the adventure path and go through all the plot points that are in it, then you really do need to get back as fast as possible with, turn it around as fast with the fewest plot points being lost before you get back on track that you have to now retread or figure out. But, in reality, if it's not something, if the players are really having a lot of fun and it's your homebrew, you took this because you wanted to play the game, no harm, no foul if that ends up being more important to you. But if that's not what you want, then you got to get right back as soon as you possibly can before you lose too much of the momentum.
Interesting.
Because I think one of the benefits of running a published game, we've talked about this a bit, it is a bookended game. You do have a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Yep, good point.
You can actually resolve a game. This is not a campaign that goes for years. This is generally, these things last about a year of gameplay, the big published games. And one of the benefits is you get to finish and say, we did it. We completed this module. Now let's go on to a new one. And so, just trying to keep to the plot and keep things moving. I find that very rewarding, both as a player and as a games master.
Yeah, because we think about it like a TV show, right? Especially more of a, say, like a new streaming show. It's like 10 episodes. While those might have some, like, there's some little side stuff that happens in the middle. Like, they got to keep it tight. Otherwise, there's those shows that they really kind of lose the thread, and then you're like, well, what? Then people lose interest, right? So, I think that's a really good point, is to get back that as soon as possible.
For me, it doesn't matter. It always should have an end. We talked about this before, and, published or non-published, it's always good to have some place that you end up that's satisfying. And I think the published adventures, they're all about that, right? Finding a spot that's satisfying, a satisfying end. But I think you should look for that all the time, honestly.
No, that's a good point, because often a lot of games don't have an end, or don't actually come to an end, because they spend too much time in wanting to hold on to the characters and wanting to level up too much. And then you kind of, when you look back on games, I found the games that had an end, like, you're just going to think of those more fondly. You're just going to think of that there was that conclusion. There was impermanence to something. There was an end. So yeah, so cool. So finally, any other final tips as far as running that you guys can think of, or?
No, I think that's I feel that we've explored that pretty well, actually.
James, anything?
Yep, I'm happy to move on to players.
I guess, yeah. There's really not much there for players, but just going off of that, is there anything you guys can think of as far as ending? Let's talk about ending. Like, are there any tips and tricks to ending the actual campaign, or have we covered that? Like, is there anything you can think of like, well, you're trying to bring it in for that home run? Like, are there any challenges there, or are there any tips that you have as far as getting to that kind of end and making it as kind of impactful as possible? James, I guess I'll go to you. I know this is all off script.
Well, these kind of work whether you're running a homebrew or a published campaign. But my big tips for ending a published adventure is still allowing the reflection period prior to the big boss battle. So it's kind of like that shitty thing in Survivor. I don't know if you guys watched that terrible that terrible reality TV show. But in the second to last episode, they always make them reflect on the journey that they've had. And so I always put in a session where the players actually have an opportunity to discuss everything that's gone on, and that also helps for them to kind of coalesce the plot in their minds, and it also allows them to reflect on their motivation as to why they've been there. And because it's a published adventure, it's quite easy to go back through the book to kind of get a sense of all those things, so you can bring that up quite well for them. Okay. And then with the big boss battle, of course, you've got those elements of why you're doing it, and it is scripted and laid out for you. I don't think I've ever run a boss battle as scripted in the book. I think I always invariably have to tailor that, because your player characters have, like, no group's the same, right? And by the time that you've gotten to the end of a published campaign, you're probably around the level 10 to 20 mark, somewhere in the upper levels if you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, or your characters are skilled, and the choices that they've had in their development means that they're probably skilled in different ways that any other group's ever been that have tried to achieve this ending. So I actually put a lot of time into tailoring the final conflict, so that it lets my players shine, but also challenges them, because each choice that they've made to make their character stronger is also a choice in a weakness that can be exploited. So I always make sure that I've kind of focused in on that last session.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Is that you want to be able to capitalize on their weaknesses and have whatever choices they've made, their strengths, and impact the final battle. And that's also a good point, is because I think no matter any combat in the book, the end one's going to be the most glaring where this happens, where, because the party composition and the way these games work, like the strength of a party or how weak they are as far as mechanically is those things are only going to increase as they gain in levels because of the complexity of the systems. So you can have one group, maybe at level 2, they were all kind of the same if you played this game maybe 3 times or 4 times, whatever, with different groups. But by level 10, level 12, level 16, they're just going to be so completely different on a power level that no one could, no publisher could ever write something that would kind of encapsulate. So I think that's a really good thing. And I really liked the idea of having it, no matter if they have it or not, having it that interlude, right, is what you were saying, having that interlude right before. That might even go to another episode we're talking about. So Carl, is there anything else here that you can think of? Or
No, I think in the back of my mind, I was thinking of this. James nailed it. It's that final boss battle has to be looked at kind of as the set piece it is, and look at the tactics that are, because the book's going to tell you some tactics, right? The book is going to tell you this guy's going to do NY, X, Y, and Z, and then but it's never right because of what you hit on. Is that all the players are different, the skills are different. I think, isn't there a famous actual play where the big bad got hit by a counter spell at the last minute and completely changed it, and everybody was laughing about it? Maybe that's not what you want in your particular end of your adventure path. So I think that's really the most important thing. Once you get done with all the reflection, understanding how you're going to make it a challenging to those player characters without cheating, obviously, right? But making it a challenge to them is one of the key things. And James hit it right on the head there.
Yeah, because if it's a dragon that's a fire dragon and your party has acquired a bunch of immunity to fire magic items or whatever, and they're all wearing them, then that's not going to be as fun. So yeah, I think just even on that example, changing it up. Cool. Yeah. So very quickly, let's talk about players here. I mean, I don't think there's much here as far as other subjects. I mean, I think a lot of this is in the inverse, right? But I think one of the things is, as a player, I mean, you kind of talked about this, James. It's like, don't read, one thing, don't read about it. Don't look at
please don't.
Yeah, please don't. I mean, I think you can kind of, if you have questions about what kind of characters fit well into the game, ask the game master first. Sometimes game masters might not want to. So I think if your game master isn't very forthcoming about what kind of works, I think just be careful on the internet, right? Because people like to spoil things. I think it's one of the main things. And I think out of any type of game, because I don't always do this, but out of any type of game, really make your character fit into what's happening. And if you have something, really talk about it with your game master. Anything else you guys can think of as far as players' advice?
Well, understand what you're signing up for. This goes back to, we talked about having a conversation with the players about what this is all about and what they're, to help with backstory and all that sort of thing. But understand what you're getting into and you're signing up for. If this has a certain tone or it has a certain, expectations, you're buying into it. Don't get 3 adventures in and just try to go off the rails because you know what's trying to happen, and you go, well, I don't want to do that. My player character would not do that. Let's go do something else. And then you really are, of all things, Adventure Pass, you are signing up for an experience. You're buying into an experience, and so embrace it. Do some things that maybe you think you might not do, but it's what moves the story forward. Embrace it, right? That's what you wanted to play. You wanted to play this book. Embrace it. Lean into it.
Yep. Absolutely. And be gentle on your games master. Don't, if something isn't working or you're like, this NPC or this chapter is absolute rubbish, just remember it's not the poor bugger that's running it. It's a written adventure, It's like, they haven't done it to you. It's the author. And get on with the next chapter as quick as you can.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, so it sounds like we hit that one pretty good, Eric? What do you think? You got anything else there?
Yeah, I've learned things, certainly. I still, personally, the way my mind works, I don't like running Adventure Path, but I feel more confident than ever that I could after talking to you blokes. So,
All right, well, awesome.
Try it. You should try it sometime. It's great for being lazy.
All right. Well, hey, thanks everyone for tuning in. I hope you got something out of it. Remember to drop by masteringtherepg.com to find out our other projects and contact and support us. Again, you can email comments, questions, asking Eric to adjudicate issues at gamemaster@masteringtherepg.com. That's gamemaster@masteringtherepg.com. And we would love positive reviews. We'd love you to tell your friends, all that good stuff. And we enjoy doing this, so be sure to support us the best you can in any way possible. So once again, this is Carl with Eric and James saying, hey, say goodbye, guys.
Bye, guys.
Sayonara.
Thought you were going to say happy game.
And happy game.
And happy game.